All right, we're testing the microphone and everything seems to be working. Today, my throat feels even worse than yesterday. I am a little sick. If you've been following along with our new rebooted podcast that I started on Sunday. Um, so today we're going to talk about a couple of topics I wrote down. We didn't get talk about the Oscars yesterday on Monday, so today we're going to start off with the Oscars. Then we're going to talk about the season 2 premiere of Shadow and Bones coming out on Netflix. I'm excited about that. That'll be coming out on Thursday this week, I believe. And then lastly, probably a couple thoughts about just what's going on in the news and life in general. All right, so let's get into it. Welcome, beautiful humans. So, the Oscars. This is going to be pretty short and simple because I didn't watch the Oscars or anything like that, but I have a couple thoughts about the big winner for the night. So, Everything Everywhere All at Once. What a great title, by the way, for a movie. It just evokes so much emotion. Before you even see the movie, you might not necessarily know what the movie's about. Titles don't always do that, but it makes you curious. So that was really good. I love that title. I believe, the movie won, the directors won, the writing, which I think were also directors, so the writing, the directing was excellent, and then, of course, the lead actress, actor, she won, and that was a really big accomplishment. She definitely deserved it, um, but let's talk about how these fantasy escapism movies are doing. Just a little background. I don't I don't really consider myself someone who in any way has any kind of professional knowledge of movie or filmmaking, but I certainly have enjoyed movies throughout my life. I certainly am a cinephile in the sense that I love movies, and I did take, college coursework on, screenwriting and, movie, uh, film studies just for fun. That had nothing to do with my major whatsoever in undergrad. Those were just some really fun classes I took, and I happen to love. Um, Sometimes I think about it, if I lived in California, would I have tried to break into the industry? It's possible, but it's kind of, a chaotic industry, and for someone like me that's very risk averse, I don't think I could handle that, necessarily. Maybe if I had a family member that was already in the business and it was more of a kind of a stable choice, so to say, that I could rely on, maybe I would be in that industry. A lot of folks in the film industry that are successful tend to have other family members in the industry. It doesn't matter if you're a producer, a director, a actor, writer, any of that. So it's kind of incredible because this particular film, there wasn't a lot of nepotism in it, um, and it was just a very successful film. Again, it had to do with escapism, so that kinda makes sense to me, post-pandemic, probably a lot of people, want to have a view of the world that's not necessarily 100% based in, gritty reality, so to say. Like, World War II movies were very popular for a long time with the Oscars as far as winning awards and such. And now we're seeing a lot of different variety of films. Of course, fantasy films have always been popular in general, but it's nice to see them recognized for the creative work that they represent and not just seen as something to please the public, that they can actually be artistic and push the film medium as an artistic form, and I believe that's what happened here. So it was just a beautiful performance, beautiful creative work, a lot of moving components that all came together for a really beautiful piece of work, which was, ultimately the end result. So very excited about that for them. As far as the wonderful fanfare of, um, you know, the wonderful design of, the dresses and clothing that was on display, because the Oscars in and of itself, in a way, is almost an a live art performance, right? Performative art in a way. And so that's kind of how the red carpet is for these major Hollywood events. But of course, whoa, this year there was no red carpet. It was a champagne colored, whatever that is. You know, why did they change the color of the carpet? They gave an explanation for it, but I kind of feel like it's silly. Whatever, they want to make the carpet, it's fine. As long as they don't make it that lime green so that people can do like could you imagine if they made the carpet green and then people would make all kinds of stuff for the actors to like walk on. It could be like all kinds of fantasy backgrounds, right? Because you could green screen it. So very interesting celebration of um, clothing and attire kind of art on display. But I'm only going to mention one person because honestly, that's all that needs to be mentioned, and that is Rihanna. Again, she only needs one name. She's freaking Rihanna. Her performance dress that she wore was incredible, completely hand done. The embellishment was insane. What I loved about the silhouette and the design of the dress in particular is it was in no way trying to hide her form, her female form, the fact that she is pregnant. It was a celebration of the body that she's currently inhabiting. She was able to sing, unrestricted and just looked gorgeous, attention grabbing. And of course, the textile itself was just mesmerizing. So I really feel like it complemented the mood of the performance and her as a person. I'm sure she felt beautiful in it, and she deserves to feel beautiful. When you're pregnant, it is quite uncomfortable. I mean, you have a living, breathing human growing inside of you, pushing on all of your organs. And she's to the point, I'm assuming she's in her second, maybe going on to her third trimester. It gets to be very uncomfortable. Your body just feels smushed from the inside out. It is not a great feeling. I don't know people that talk about having a blissful pregnancy. I can't relate. I had personally experienced, according to the physicians, even though I was um, older and considered, what do they call me? Geriatric. Had a geriatric pregnancy because I was, 35, which is considered over the hill for pregnancies. I had a very otherwise super normal, super healthy pregnancy. Like, you really could not have asked for a better pregnancy. There was at no point during my pregnancy that anything at all was a risk factor other than my age, of course. Um, so it was also a very uncomfortable pregnancy, and many times was I not happy. I had all kinds of terrible pregnancy symptoms, extreme fatigue, your mobility begins to get limited, your range of motion, your balance, swelling, random appetite, random the way that hormones impact your I already mentioned mental fatigue, but it also impacts your emotional burden that you can handle in a given day, your tolerance for other people, so to say. Um, and of course, I had all sorts of nausea, and other, dietary issues while being pregnant. And here's Rihanna performing, looking absolutely gorgeous. And that wasn't the only dress she wore. So she started out with a dress when she entered on the champagne carpet, um, which was a very deep, dark chocolate leather and mesh dress, I guess is the best way to describe it. And I loved it because it even showed her little like indent of her belly button, her pregnant belly button. And it was just the most beautiful dress because it allowed her to stand out. She looked glamorous, she looked gorgeous. The texture of the different textiles, that were used for the design were incredible. Again, I mean, just a stunning, stunning piece of work. And then, of course, she had her dress in the evening, and again, slayed. So, honestly, we could talk about any of the other people and the dresses they wore, but what does it really matter when there was Rihanna? And I highly encourage, look up the dresses to see what they look like, see what I'm talking about. Rihanna deserves the hype. Um, I'm not saying she's the best human to ever exist in all history, but man, if she isn't top-notch human quality material, right? Pretty incredible human being. Obviously talented, intelligent, and I think, she has shown herself to be a very caring person, which is important in life. And I'm happy that she is getting to enjoy her life as a mother. So that's really exciting. All right. So the Oscars, we can tick that box. We talked about it. Be interesting to see if there's anything you're interested in. I'm supposed to make a bracket tonight for my family goes and has a pool every time this year because of March Madness, and I need to make my basketball bracket, like I said. And I don't know. I haven't really been following anything. The only news I know for sure is that UNC is not going to be in the tournament. So that's a big news event if you're a native North Carolinian. UNC didn't make it this year, which is kind of big news. And I learned that out through, of all things, Instagram. I didn't even realize I was following UNC. I did not go to UNC. It's not my alma mater, but I have, a lot of my friends went to UNC. My coworkers are UNC graduates. I know a lot of people. I've dated a lot of people who went to UNC. If you're a North Carolinian, there's some major universities and almost everyone goes to one of them. It's like Duke, UNC, NC State. I think Wake Forest is another really big university in our state. But anyway, and I think for basketball, Davidson's pretty well known. I will always choose to cheer for a local NC North Carolinian college team over any other in the country. Of course, my bracket usually doesn't win because of that. So I wonder if anyone else has made some brackets out there. That would be kind of fun to know. I don't know what team you think's gonna take it all. We can all obviously, that would be like, Las Vegas odds right there. So, yeah, so following up on the news we talked about yesterday, I did mention some of the banking news with the Silicon Valley Bank, and I'll have a couple of follow-up points to it. So, again, a lot of people may or may not just know the general, function of a bank. What is a bank? A bank is a business. Like any other business, it is based on risk. Risk is inherent in starting any business. There is um, less risk or more risk depending on how you structure your business, but banks are inherently risky because you essentially have what you're trying to do is you hold an account for depositors. You hold their money and you get, and it's like a promise that when they need to take out their money's going to be there. But in the meantime, you as a bank, you're trying to make a profit. You don't make money by just holding people's money, right? Because most account holders don't pay to have a bank account. Now, some banks do that. We won't talk about that. Most banks make their money from investing the money they have and making interest on loans that they loan out from the pool of money that is actually their depositors' cash. So Silicon Valley Bank was kind of unusual. Is a large bank. It was a top 20 bank as far as like total assets. It had over $250 billion in assets, which is massive. So no, even though I guess you could theoretically think of it as a small bank because it didn't have very many depositors, it certainly controlled quite a bit of financial assets, V- so anyway, um, what else, what made this bank quite unusual is who were the depositors. So I might have mentioned yesterday, depositors can be just you, me, regular people, regular workers with salaried checks, right? But they can also be just small businesses. Businesses get loaned money, but businesses can also be account holders. themselves, and they run their payroll. If you're a law firm, you can have different accounts set, for your clients, set aside for your clients. So, SVB was unusual because its account holders were all these startups that had a glut of cash infused into them during the pandemic because, of course, everyone was relying on, um, a lot of tech services at the time and not so much in-person services. And so the tech companies had a huge amount of cash. They put it in a bank to hold it. And as they would need it to pay salaries, to invest in different endeavors, to scale up, all that kind of stuff, they would need to then pull out the funding. Well, you know, that works in theory. But what also happens, what you can say that was unusual, is there's, individuals within the tech community that hold a lot of influence. And this is something I think about the banking system. I think about the way that we have social media, the way that we have these super hyper influential people out there in the world putting out their business advice, telling people to put money here, to take money out here. That can have major ramifications. I think it's very dangerous. I don't actually think that these folks that give financial advice, I mean, I see it as a danger, because it's just one person's opinion, and you can create just as like a regular person, if you have enough of a following, if enough people look up to you for influence, they will follow your advice blindly, whether it makes sense or not. And essentially, within a 48-hour period, a highly influential, I'm gonna say tech bro. I don't care what anyone says. He's a tech bro, you know, is someone with a lot of money, but, and I'm not saying he's not smart and savvy, but he's basically a tech bro that all the other tech bros, you know, look up to, and they just mindlessly followed his lead, pulled out all the cash, from this bank, caused its collapse in 48 hours. And what's insane about all this is the bank almost didn't collapse. In fact, if the Dodd-Frank bill had not been repealed or allowed to lapse under the Trump administration, the bank would have held up fine. And essentially, what that bill required, the Dodd-Frank bill, well, it wasn't a bill; it was a law. It was a bill that then was passed, but then it had like a sunset to it. So unless the law was renewed, it would expire. And Trump allowed the Dodd-Frank, um, law, which was a regulation on banks that they had to hold a certain amount of cash assets. And, they couldn't be, for example, invested in these treasury bonds, which were the thing that got devalued, that kind of screwed over Silicon Valley Bank. Um, so yeah, all of this is to say, you have a lot of safeguards in banking. And when you don't have that, and then you have this, ability of one individual to be highly influential, where all the tech bros just like followed like lemmings this guy's example and just ran off a cliff, completely collapsing a giant bank in the United States as far as, like, total assets. This is a major bank to just collapse like that. It's insane. So, this is why we need safeguards, you know, bumper rails, regulations, whatever you wanna call it. The bank would still be in existence, would still be fine if we had had the Dodd-Frank, and it was so close to not collapsing. That's the sad part in all this, is it was so close to not collapsing. It just needed a few billion more in assets that it didn't invest. So what the Dodd-Frank would have done is it would have said, "Hey, bank, SVB, you gotta hold these assets liquid and not invest them in things like the treasury bonds," because the treasury bonds were essentially an upside down investment. It would have been fine though, because the treasury bonds would have eventually gone back up in value. It's kind of like a long-term investment. If 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 all these tech bros hadn't made a run on the bank, if all these tech stars hadn't pulled their capital out of it, it would have been fine. Everything would have been just fine. So it's a little frustrating as just a regular person. This caused so much chaos this week in, the markets, it's gonna totally impact how other banks, act. This is gonna have a major ripple effect, and it's just frustrating because we had safeguards, we learned from mistakes of the past, right? The 2007, 2008 time period and what happened with those banks failing. It's just crazy. And a lot of it is because it only takes one person. If one person, one individual can have this much effect on an entire country's economy, not just our economy. It ended up impacting other economies like the British economy, the UK economy, all across the world. One person should not have that much influence, in my opinion. I think that's insane that we have a system that doesn't prevent that from happening. We come up with all these laws and regulations on people's individual lives. You can't even jaywalk, right? You can't walk across a street without getting a ticket from a cop if there's a sidewalk or a crosswalk within view, right? You can't That's insane to me that can be ticketed, but one person who causes mass financial crisis, 0 repercussions for him. What repercussions have there happened? Nothing. I'm not gonna use his name because I don't wanna give him any more influence than he already has, and it's just insane to me that a person can have that much influence. Anyway, I guess that's a mini rant for the day, but that's just a follow-up to yesterday's news. So, moving on to today's news, I, am pretty excited about a show that's coming up on, Netflix, season 2. I've been waiting, God, it feels like forever, but it's the Shadow and Bone series. If you haven't watched season 1, I'm gonna give you just the briefest of synopsis. So, go ahead and fast forward through this if you don't wanna know the synopsis. Or if you've seen it, but it's been a while and you don't have time to rewatch it before Thursday, I'm gonna give you synopsis. I have watched season 1 of Shadow and Bones probably 10 to 12 times because I really like it, and I did rewatch it recently, about a week ago. So I feel like it's fresh in my mind. The series is based off of a book, several books. I have not read any of those books. I have no desire to read those books. I like to have things be separate and apart. I love reading books, by the way, but I actually prefer to see the visual first and then sometimes read the books after because the books are always better. Books are always better than the visual format. Almost, almost. I don't know. Because, when it comes to Dune as a book, I do prefer a couple of the visual video performances more than the book itself. But man, Dune is a good series. Okay. So, synopsis of season 1, there is we start off and we learn about a young girl, and essentially she is someone who is completely orphaned. We don't know who her mother, who her father is, but we do know that she has a different background than most of the people in her country that she's living in, and they call it on the show, Shu. I have no idea how that's spelled, but I'm gonna spell it SHU, I think, but it's pronounced Shu, like, the shoe you put on your feet. In the show, it talks about basically she's always been different and treated differently, and I believe it's alluded to pretty clearly, that it has something to do with her being of a different race. She visually her body looks different than other people. They mention her eyes more than once. I believe the actor that performs, her character, the main character's role, is, half, or at least in part Asian, in part European of some kind. And I think that's supposed to have the audience understand that this is a person who's caught in between worlds. Culturally, she identifies with the country she lives in, but visually she gets treated differently because she looks like a person from a different country that is apparently an enemy to this country. So, it's very interesting to have a series like this, for me, I identify and think about these issues of, I mean, it's racism is literally what the show is touching on. It's just not we're not calling they're not calling it racism, but it's delving into that part of society. It's asking those kind of questions. It's challenging the viewer about those. And I think about this issue quite a bit because my daughter is biracial, or she has genetic material from 2 different continents on the planet, and I often, am concerned about how she will perceive herself, how she will imagine herself to fit into the world that she is. Will she well, we know she probably will, so when will she, experience feeling different? How will that affect her emotionally? How will that affect her mental health growing up? Um, so from my perspective, I was very interested in watching the series from that aspect because very it's interesting because I'm a white person, European ancestry, honestly just like UK. All of my genetics is from, the British Isles. So I am a person who appears like the majority within a country where, we're in the majority, in power, whatever. And so there's a lot of privilege that comes along with that. And so it's interesting. I like to read books. I like to watch movies that have an alternative perspective to the one that I grew up. So, number one, the show, just on its face, without anything else, is super duper cool because unless you're someone who is, biracial, it's gonna be different. It's gonna be a different experience for you, so super interesting. Alright, so we start off with this girl, she is an orphan, she knows she's different, but she doesn't understand all that that is. She grew up, um, not being particularly athletic, so, in the orphanage where she grew up, she was kind of raised to be into books. So she's really kind of a nerd, she likes books. So we like that as a character, as a main character, especially because usually it's like the side, like the best friend of the main character that's the book nerd, like AKA, let's think of like Harry Potter. It's always like a side friend that's the book nerd. But in this, it's the main character. And the show doesn't really go into it, but that is a key part of her character is that she's kind of a research nerd. She loves libraries. The show shows that a little bit. It'll be interesting to see if season 2 explores that aspect of her personality more. Probably not because visually it's not as interesting. Um, but yeah, and in this orphanage, other than her love of knowledge and books, especially stories about these mythical creatures, we learn that she has a best friend. Her best friend is male, and so part of season 1 is a little bit of confusion because she obviously loves this friend, childhood friend that she's known her whole life. Is it a love that you have for your brother, or is it kind of like a love that you have for someone you're romantically interested in? So I think there is this tension between those 2 characters all along season 1. And in the beginning, we find out they're both in the military because the country that they grew up in is, basically constantly at war. And we find out that the reason they're constantly at war is because of this struggle with their neighbors, and they're just incredibly militaristic. There's this giant divide between, I'm gonna say, like, the east and the west of the country. And it's really interesting because a lot of countries within themselves have a divide in opinion. I don't care what country you're in. You could be in Britain, you can be in Germany, you could be in Italy, you could be in France, you could be in, Japan, China, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, definitely. Obviously, the United States. Let me just start naming more countries: Brazil, Chile, Ecuador. I want to make sure I hit all the continents. Well, we haven't named South Africa or Egypt or anyway, every single country I have named, there have been a divide, and usually it's a geographical divide even. not always city versus rural. Sometimes it's like literally like an east versus west or a south versus north. And it's interesting because in this book, they have a physical manifestation of a divide. Now, of course, it's a fantasy show based on a fantasy novel book. So instead of just saying these things, everything's got to be like, some kind of like magical, mystical reason. So in this, there's like some I'm gonna call him a wizard. They don't call them wizards within the book. They have, like, a special name for it, but it's essentially there's normal people, and then there's people with abilities, powers, wizards, so to say, and, I mean, you could think of any kind of, like, fantasy, series that you can think of. You can think of X-Men. Oh, there's these few humans that have special powers. Um, there's obviously Harry Potter already mentioned, oh, there's a few people on the planet that have these magical powers. Again, this is kind of a typical trope in fantasy, science fiction, whatever genre you want to talk about. The fantasy genre as a whole, there's a few people on the planet that have special abilities. And are they persecuted for them? Oh, you know it. Lord knows we can't have someone different not being persecuted. So in this society, this is a group of people with special abilities. Historically, they were persecuted. Now, magically, suddenly, they're no longer persecuted. And now they're seen as like assets for this military thing, this divide that's happened between that split the countries that came up about because of one of these wizard people. It's almost like, it created stability for them to be a need in society. So now that they're needed in society, they're no longer ex, hunted down and killed and, eradicated from society. Now the society has a need for them. We can actually think about this in the real world context of, um, a good example is, once a group of people is needed, suddenly they're a lot less ostracized because we need them. So all these German Nazi scientists, bad people, right? They were making weapons of mass destruction, doing all kinds of crazy, awful um, experiments for Germany. We hated that. But as soon as we got them to come do it for us in the West, right? Western Europe countries got to take control of that brain power. All of a sudden, it's a good thing because we're using it for a good purpose, right? See how that goes? Yeah. Well, so in the story, the magical people go from being enemies to being allies, but there's still a tenuous strain, right? This is still a tenuous need for them. And so this is the world that this young girl who is now a young adult is coming up in, and she's in the military, and everything starts off because she is reunited with her childhood friend who she loves, but she doesn't know is it a brother kind of a love or a boyfriend kind of a love. Well, he has his life put in serious danger, crazy danger within this thing that is dividing the nation. And suddenly, lo and behold, the main character has a special ability. Duh, we knew that was gonna happen, right? That's just so obvious. Because of course she has to be special and unique, and she ends up being incredibly unique. She has an ability or a power that apparently no one's ever had before in the history of this made up fantasy world. And she becomes almost a savior of sort. And what's really interesting about the series that I really love that you can do in a film media is the story unfolds for multiple characters from multiple viewpoints, and the timeline of it is a little off. So actually, the other characters that are on the other divide, the chasm, the darkness, whatever the shadow that's dividing everyone. Um, what we think is the beginning of their timeline is actually already in the future of where the timeline starts for the others. So it's always fun when those things happen. It can make it a little difficult to follow along if you're not like someone used to the fantasy realm or whatever. But the story goes on, and it's kind of one of those things where I want to call it um it's almost a whodunit. It's kind of like a thriller. There's a lot of suspense, and we're just trying to like catch up with these characters. And there's two major groups of characters, and basically we're seeing their worlds come together and collide, but we're kind of following the stories of both of them. And I'm going to call it like the story of the normies and the story of the extraordinaries. And we kind of see them come together. Will they be allies? Won't they be allies? They have a mutual respect, we find. By the end of the season 1, these group of characters come together, and they have a certain worldview that even though they grew up totally different places, they literally grew up on opposite sides of this divide, right? For this world that we're pretending that we're in. And yet their worldview on what is right and what is wrong is the same. And that's what unites them. And that's kind of interesting because, again, we can think about it in our own world, in our own context, and we can think, well, there's people halfway across the world that have grown up entirely different cultures than we have, totally maybe different life experiences than we have, but yet we can still come together as humans, human to human, and think, you know what, we can solve our problems, we can come together, we can agree on things. So that's one of the things that I found the whole story of season 1, besides the fun, fight scenes and, interesting plot twists, all of that. What made it fun to watch was this idea that people can come together in extraordinary ways sometimes, unexpected ways, right? That's what makes great fantasy novels. Think of Lord of the Rings, right? It's unexpected friends. These are, again, that the reason Lord of the Rings is so popular and great is because it's all these really different people having a common goal, a common vision, a common solution, and they're all working together for it. And when is there trouble? Well, the conflict is when one or the others, they get separated, they have temptations, they disagree on how to move forward in the plan. And that's what makes it interesting. So for season 2, I'm really interested because, of course, by the end of season 1, the main character, she becomes fully in tune with her power. There's some things that happen along the way. She has her powers enhanced, but the main thing is she learns how to control it. And while she's learned to control it, there's a second love story happening. I would say an even better love story unfolding with her and basically a more experienced magician, wizard, whatever we want to call him, who has the opposite kind of end of the spectrum power that she does. She brings light, literal light to the table. He brings darkness. I mean, if it's not the most obvious allegory that ever was, I mean, it's about like Star Wars hitting you in the face with the Jedi and the Sith. One represents positive, good light, and the other one's all like red and darkness and evil. I mean, all about the one versus the many anyway. A lot of these stories kind of beat you over the head with light versus dark. And so in this whole season 1, as an audience member that watches a lot of fantasy, that even though these two main characters are getting hot and steamy with one another, and man, I wish they had gone a little bit further in season 1 because that would have been really great because the two actors that portray those characters have a lot of chemistry. I would have loved just, me outside opinion. I don't know what the book material original content was. I wish they had delved in a little deeper, even more so with the romance between those two. Because I think it would have made for a more interesting plot in general. And the choice that she had to make it ultimately at the end of season 1, a more difficult choice. And we would have understood her pain from making that choice more. So here she is. She's light, falling in love with darkness, essentially. We find out that he's this really bad guy. Well, is he so bad? All he really wants to do is protect his fellow magicians, his fellow, humans with special abilities. And at the end of the day, is that really so evil? It's how he does it though, right? He thinks to be saved that his people need more power. And the more power they have, the more they will be protected essentially. No one's gonna touch them if they're so powerful. But not only that, he has to have all the power. Sounds a lot like the Sith. Or, let's think of another Harry Potter allegory. Sounds a lot like Voldemort, right? Like the evil characters in almost every fantasy, they always end up being this one person who maybe has a good intention, but it's the way they want to carry out their intention, and it ends up being, well, it's got to be all on me. I have to do it all on my own. I think of, right, the Marvel movies. What did Thanos want to do? It wasn't a bad concept. He wanted to protect the universe. He saw living creatures as a bad thing in the universe. So he wanted to kill half of all living things. It's horrific, right? It's a logical conclusion that's kind of horrific. But his reason, his intent was arguably a positive, a nice, so again, think about Thanos, think about the Sith, think about, Voldemort. This main character in Shadow and Bones isn't necessarily all bad. It's what he does that's bad. What makes a person good or bad? Is it what they think? Is it how they treat people? It's so interesting. So this is why I thought the season 1 was so good and why I've watched it so many times. It's also just a really interesting, show to watch because the more you watch it, the way that the story unfolded was a very, like, a back and forth between various characters, and so there was a lot of subtle, symbolism that was happening. There was a lot of subtle storytelling. And so it was just a fun series to watch and rewatch over and over again because the more you watch it, the more you kind of catch on to those little things here and there, the subtlety in the acting, the subtlety in the costume changing. And it was also just very fun and entertaining and pretty short, so you could watch it several times. So I'm really looking forward to season 2. It looks like there's gonna be even more visual effects, which is awesome because now you have basically the most powerful wizard of light and the most powerful wizard of darkness, and there's gonna be an epic battle. I mean, I'd be thoroughly disappointed if there wasn't. And there's gonna be some hard choices. At the end of season 1, the hard choice that she had to make was essentially to, you know, betray this person that she had been falling in love with, this guy of Wizard of Darkness or whatever, and realized that he was saying all these really lies to her. Essentially, she's realizing all these lies and she understands that he wants to do all these terrible things. I think in season 1, what is gonna happen is she is going to begin to understand some of the logic and why he said those things. That would be interesting to me, is start to kind of have her character waver. Like maybe his reasoning wasn't so bad. Maybe what he was saying made sense. Maybe maybe this black and white view of the world that I've had is not so great, and the world is in fact lots of different various shades of gray. There's not pure good. There's not pure evil. That's, to me, the best science fiction, the best fantasy, the best stories in general. I don't care what stories, Wuthering Heights. We could talk about all kinds of Shakespeare plays. The best characters, the best stories, the best plots are ones I think that represent our human experience the best, which is the fact that the world isn't black and white. There isn't an there isn't 100% right answer that every human in existence would make that exact same choice. If there is a truth in this world, if there is a pure truth, it would mean that every human that ever existed in all time would also agree and also say it's the pure truth. To my knowledge, and I'm not saying I know everything, but I've read a lot, I've experienced a lot, I've traveled a lot. I have yet to see one thing that every human and of all places in all time have agreed to as the right decision. And you can say, "Well, Carrie, let's think about like some pretty extreme examples." But I don't care what example you come up with. I don't care what example you come up with. There is a human in history that will have a different reason than you, and they will think that they are 100% right. How about I mean, this is a horrific example, but again, this podcast is not for kids. So if you're under 18, please stop listening because this is a philosophical adult concept that we're going to talk about, and it's meant for adults to think about. And that is the idea of child sacrifice. That's a heavy topic. That's a super heavy topic. And guess what? Many societies and many humans for millennia believed in child sacrifice. I'm talking infant sacrifice. I'm talking, for them, they truly believed that what they were doing was right. Well, you'll find historically that child sacrifice often went along with periods in a society's time of famine, of less than enough production. Now, we can look and say, "Oh my god, it's awful. They were killing all of those babies." And it's horrifying for me as a mother. I mean, I can't tell you, it's horrifying. But then I think about it from a practical standpoint and I say, a lot of babies right now in Afghanistan, after the collapse that happened last year when the US military pulled out, there was in literally a catastrophic amount of starvation. And babies, small children were the first ones impacted because their nutrition is so like desperate and balanced, and they their nutritional needs are like literally if you've ever taken care of a small child, especially an infant, I mean, they go from being perfectly fine to just catastrophic in like no time at all because they don't have the fat stores that an adult would and they can't endure the hunger or the time without calories that like an adult human can. So, were these child sacrifices to, the harvest gods, so to say, for these past cultures, was it a mercy? Anthropologists hypothesize this. It's a tough topic. Were you thinking you were gonna think about this today? Probably not. It feels wrong to sacrifice children. When you're in a society of abundance with enough food, unthinkable. It's a tough thing. It's a tough thing. So, it's shades of gray. It's shades of gray. The more you read, the more you learn, the more you study, different cultures, historical human cultures. If you've ever, take one of those, like, online Harvard courses on anthropology. I mean, any kind of philosophy course if you can take it. These are not easy concepts. A lot of people don't wanna think about these things. It's easy sometimes to think of the world as black and white. That there's always a right choice and there's always a wrong choice to make. That's easy because in a way you don't have to think. But guess what? We're human, right? This is a human podcast right here. That's what we're talking about. This is a planet filled with humans. And what makes it so special is the fact that we can think beyond ourselves and our immediate needs. There are countless examples of humans throughout history that have put literally their basic survival instincts, just the instinct to breathe, they can stop it because there is something that they believe in greater. Think of all of the humans in history that have been willing to put their life on the line. We talked about it yesterday, the example of the women protesting in Iran for their freedom. For them, it's live free or die. And they are choosing to risk death for freedom. Freedom of choice, simple choices. Simple choices, just like with their hair. Can they dance? It's like little silly things that we take for granted in Western culture now, but remember, women in Western culture didn't always have this freedom. In fact, many people, not just women, people who are different races, people who are different classes, people of different education levels, people of different ownership, like property ownership levels. You had different rights in a society. Um, for a long time, if you didn't own land, you didn't have a voice in government. And for a long time, the only people who could even own land, even had an ability to own land, were white men. I mean, that's why, we talk about it as a cultural thing in the Western world. Now, this idea of ownership and all this kind of thing and a voice in politics, this is something that has f been an issue globally in many cultures. The various South American cultures, the various, cultures in Africa, various cultures in East Asia, all the different kind of dynasties that you can study. It's very interesting to start looking at, historically, the way that cultures are organized. The more organized, the more restrictive a society is, the more you will start to see unequal treatment of various humans within that culture. And so why I like Shadow and Bones is because they have various different groups of people that you see, watching it as just a regular person, you see them being oppressed. So, for example, the this magical, the group of people with superpowers, right? They have a certain level of being treated as different, oppressed. Are they oppressed or are they privileged? There's this whole thing. Um, then there's, obviously all the various countries are at war. There's like a country that almost, I think they're called Druscala, or maybe that's a special force within it, but those are like almost seen as like this Viking warrior country. Then there's this country of people, the Shu people that are different. So all of these various groups that are being treated differently. And then within all of this, you see that there's actually a treatment of men and women different within the show, which is really interesting. That they still have that westernized, or other cultures around the world also do this, where there's a unequal treatment between the genders. So the series is really good. I don't know if I've sold it, so to say, as I've described it, but I hope maybe if you've already watched it, maybe you'll watch it again with these insights or thoughts. And certainly for season 2, I think it's gonna be super interesting. I highly recommend. The previews on Netflix are really incredible. I am just so thrilled because the main magician guy, we weren't sure, in season 1 if he was gonna live or not because of how the season ended. Because again, the main character, who is the magician of light, so to say, she kind of uses her power and takes ownership of it. She at one point was a puppet, quite literally a puppet being used by the dark magician, wizard, powerful person, whatever. She ends up being able to use her own power and kind of overwhelms him. Is she more powerful than him? Well, she has less experience, but that doesn't mean that she can't control and become just as powerful, essentially. So it's going to be a very light versus dark season 2. I think it's going to be my prediction. Again, I haven't read the book, so I'm just predicting willy nilly here. I predict that her relationship is going to be explored a little bit more with the guy who we don't know if it's her brother or a lover kind of situation, the fellow orphan that grew up with her. I think season 2, we're going to find out maybe about her parentage. Her parents would have been unusual, right? Because it would have been someone from one culture and another culture that fell in love and had a baby. So, which was her. So I'm really interested to see about her family history. Hopefully, we get to learn about that because I think that will have some interesting insights. I also want to see if she becomes more understanding, starts to see the shades of gray with, this man that she had strong emotional romantic feelings for, the dark magician. By the way, he is just like, t as far as, like, attraction level, his character, how they have him costumed, his, persona in character, for some reason, it's a very attractive vibe, as someone who is a nerd, for some reason, it's kind of like, oh gosh, in Star Wars, um, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Never mind, I don't need to go there. That's not what this podcast is about. The show looks incredible. I really hope we get, some more insight about the characters that had nothing to do with magic. The owner of the gambling house, you know, I wanna find out more about his backstory, how he came to be someone who you would think is totally morally corrupt and a terrible person, and yet he does all these things that are very against his own self-interest. He does things that are very self-sacrificing. That is very interesting. He's a very interesting character because he's not 100% black or white, he's shades of gray, and so he's very interesting. So I really like to see the development of this. I'm hoping to see, season 2. I will be watching all the episodes. I'll probably do a podcast of my thoughts, um, on just this season 2, this weekend. But hopefully this has gotten you interested in general, no matter what show you watch, whether it's, true crime series, whether it's, um, a fantasy, a sci-fi series, a cartoon series. Hopefully it gets you thinking about, what is it that I'm watching? What am I supposed to be taking away from this? Because a lot of times the writers, the creators behind these beautiful works, like we mentioned earlier, the movie that was so successful this season for the Oscars, Everything Everywhere All at Once. What is it that these creators are trying to encourage us to think of as audience members? Because 'cause we're the audience, we're being entertained, right? There's a surface level of entertainment just to watch anything. Like, is it visually cool? Like, "Oh my god, I wanna see explosions, I wanna see cool costumes, I wanna see the main characters kiss." Like, that's very entertaining just in and of itself. But then there's a lot deeper thought that sometimes goes into it, and I really believe Netflix puts time and effort into the series that they develop. I wish they had not dropped Altered Carbon. That was another really great series I loved on Netflix. Um, Again, that's Altered Carbon. If you haven't seen it and you kind of like what I described with Shadow of Bone, but you want it to be in a totally different sci-fi reality, Altered Carbon's a good one. So, with that, we had a lot of discussion today. We're at our almost to our 1 hour mark. Hopefully, you've enjoyed listening to the podcast. I started a little late today. My voice is not doing its greatest, but I've been taking some medicine for my cold. I am feeling a little bit better. I'm hoping tomorrow I can actually go into the office to work. So, wish me luck. And otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of the week, and we'll try to do this again tomorrow night. So please listen in, and we'll have a couple other topics that I'll think of that we can talk about. If you have any suggestions, I'm willing and interested in talking about them. We didn't really talk about much gym stuff today, but maybe tomorrow we'll pick that back up. All right. Have a great night. Thank you.